My chat today is going to be just a little bit more touching on some of the ecology and requirements of the koalas, and then looking at ways that we can either protect, restore or replant the landscape as well for koalas. Koalas feed primarily but not exclusively on eucalyptus leaves, and they're known to use 137 different trees species, but of which 103 are in the eucalyptus genus. So some of the things that they also eat are things like the paper bark and Melaleuca quinquenerva and things like that. So that's why a bit later I'll talk about some of the gum trees and eucalypts and how to ID them. But another thing to note is, although that's Australia-wide, they eat that number of trees in a normal location, or they usually just eat only like 3 or 4 species of eucalypt as their main sort of feed trees, and it can be as low as just 1 or 2. So when it comes to planning for what you might be planting, it's good to think about those things as well. We know that koalas prefer areas that have about 30% of the total canopy trees that are basically primary feed trees or secondary preferred trees as well. So we've got these areas where koalas might move through and they still need that habitat for connectivity, but if it's poorer soils and a lower density of those feed trees, then we're not going to find a permanent population there, and if it is, it's going to be in very low numbers. But it doesn't mean that those patches of bush aren't important for genetic flow, for animals to move around and just to stay safe as well. So sort of good to keep that in mind. Also, things to remember are koalas also need a range of age of trees as well. They'll prefer to shelter in the bigger old trees that create more shade, but then feed on the younger trees that have got that fresh new growth and things like that. And also, this is where the concept of preferred koala feed trees, and also trees that come up in the SATS surveys that get usage, could be like a shade tree as well. So they may not even eat the leaves, and things like a fig, and Maria was just saying today that in some of your plantings you've got just small figs that are only 2 metres tall, and on those really hot days the koala's sitting in there to get the maximum shade as well. So yeah, it all kind of comes back to those general rules in ecology, but we want diversity, and that's what can then benefit the koalas as well as the other fauna as well that requires that. So don't sort of just think, okay, I've heard a tallow wood's a primary feed tree, I'm going to plant a whole paddock of tallow woods. They need more than that. They need diversity through time. They need a range of age of trees and things like that as well. Also, features in the landscape to look out for are, so koalas usually, unless it's very dry or they're sick or something, don't usually come down to drink from streams and things like that. They should be able to get enough of their moisture content from the leaves themselves. However, yeah, in really dry times that may not be the case, and there's certain trees as well, be it species of trees, but also where they grow in the landscape, that will have higher moisture content in those leaves. So for instance, again, if you're thinking of property scale revegetation, a line of koala feed trees down in some low-lying paddocks or something that's more likely to have higher moisture content will help the koalas persist on the site through time during droughts and things like that as well. So yeah, again, from the guidelines, they do say a minimum habitat patch size of 2 hectares is required, but obviously the bigger the better, and normally 50 to 100 hectares is preferable to support a sustainable population. But we do know, just the way they move through the landscape, that even these stepping stones, because the landscape has come so fragmented, even just one paddock tree might be enough. Like, they can walk across the ground quite far and been known for up to a K or more across the ground, but if they have paddock trees and things like that to move across the landscape, again, it protects them from dogs and things like that, and just being so exposed. So when it comes to your property, what I get people to think about, and some of you may have done this, but property planning is really important. That doesn't mean you've got to pay a consultant thousands of dollars to come out and do all these maps and things. As simple as a mud map yourself, just get out an A4 piece of paper, draw some of the things on your land, be it your boundaries, be it where the water is, the creek is, where the hill, what do you want still in primary production if you've got cattle or orchards, what's your marginal land that you might put towards regeneration, but just starting to break up your property like that. And then also just think about where you might like to go. Like, it's also important to have an aim in mind and a goal. So, and that can vary, that's a personal thing. Like, some people will have a goal more like, okay, I just don't want to intervene too much. I'm just going to let natural processes work and just, I might do minimal input and just remove some of the weeds. Or someone might have a stronger goal, I want to manage my land for koalas and therefore I'm going to have a focus for that. Other biodiversity. So again, by thinking about what you'd like to create gives you the picture of where you're trying to get to. And that can vary, like I was saying, sort of depending where you are and things like that. And also, because we get to choose our aims and goals, there's been, touched on with Ben this morning, there's definitely been conversations about eucalypt plantings, where do eucalypts belong, rainforest country, eucalypt country. But I think rather, we don't have to get caught up so much in the sort of the black and whites of that. Like, it's very grey to start with. As a property manager, you again can decide what you're trying to create. Obviously, eucalypts, there's risks or things you've got to manage about potential fire and things like that. So you wouldn't be planting big gum trees right around your house. But even on the good red soil, like the red soil that that we, you know, associate with the big scrub and rainforest and things like that, we've got patches of what we call grass. So like Darrabee grass is a good example. I don't know if some of you have been there, but it's on the really fertile red soil. It should be rainforest country. It's not. There's eucalypts and grassland, and that's because Indigenous management, it's been burnt for thousands of years, and that's excluded rainforest as well. So this is where, again, you get to pick and choose a little bit, because if you're on the red soil, it doesn't always have to be 100% rainforest. And also in my plantings that I do on the red soil, I put some eucalypts or things like brush box and things like that. With the long-term aim, I'm not trying to create an open forest, but they'll be there for 100, 200, 300 years, depending on who's doing the management down the track. I'll expect them to die out because they won't be able to regenerate. Rainforest will persist, but in that time, it might help koalas move through that landscape. So yeah, things don't have to be black and white at all. So, yeah, so again, when you're thinking about your place, and for koalas, it's also, we mentioned some of those threats and risks as well. So how can you minimise those? So again, think about, well, it's probably not so sensible to plant eucalypts on both sides of a busy road and nowhere else, because then you're going to get the koalas drawn to that and they're going to cross the road and things. So you can, and just think about where there might be, you know, more likely dogs coming through. I'll talk about weeds in a whole thing as well, but there's also, I was going to say no point, but there's less, the habitat's not as good quality if you just plant trees and you don't do your weed control and it's for koalas, and then you've got a really dense sort of understory of things like lantana or privet or even rainforest plants and things like that, can prevent the koalas moving through as well. So yeah, again, think about some of those things when it comes to your property. Yeah.
The hardest thing, from what you said before, is you said it'd be good to have different aged trees.
Yeah.
So Ben's just planted 30-something hectares on our place. What are we going to do? How are we going to get some of them old and some of them new?
That's a great question, because you've got to start somewhere, and then what that would be is looking at managing that, because okay, sounds like that would have been a cleared paddock or it had been let go. So you're basically starting from ground zero. So yeah, so then you plant it out, but then it would look at management through time, and then how do you make sure that that native vegetation can persist and actually like regenerate, depending on where you are. You may even look at introducing fire down the track. Obviously, you've got to get your trees up and they've got to survive fire. And if that's not appropriate, you could self-thin as well. But yeah, you're at the very beginning, so maybe in 50 years' time is when the next person's going to be...
don't have to worry about
take no responsibility. You've done a great start. So just, yeah. But that also makes me think about... it can be overwhelming, like too much information. What's perfection? What am I trying to do? I don't even have time to do all these things. That you actually have made a start and doing something is fantastic, because alternatively, someone else could own your property, not be doing a thing, actually degrading it, clearing it or things. So just by being a good custodian, you're basically halfway there. And then whatever you can do is going to improve that land. So rather than get overwhelmed and sort of stuck and think, oh my gosh, it's all too hard, I can't do a thing, there's always something that we can do. And that's again where a bit of the planning can help and go, well, what's strategic for I've only got a day a month, a day a year, a day a week, what can I do with that? And that's where it's also great to make sure you kind of connect with landcare groups, local Indigenous groups, other land resource managers, talk to your neighbours, people who've been doing this longer than you as well, because we've all learnt by doing what we now might consider the wrong thing, or we've learnt techniques that we could have done that's more smart than what we've done now. As a bush regenerator, I always kind of think about restoration as what's the easiest, simplest, cheapest, most effective way to restore a vegetation community to a self-maintaining state. So the less we have to do, the better, so in my mind. So if we look at again then restoring landscapes, so the cheapest but also most important thing to do is protect anything that's existing habitat. So especially obviously if it's in good quality condition, we never can replant and return that biodiversity there. Because the diversity of species, but secondly, like the genetic diversity as well. So even if it comes down to a single paddock tree, if that's a remnant tree, that's important. So that's the sort of like the top tier of managing land in my mind, is protect everything that is remnant or old regrowth vegetation. So think about that with your properties if you have some of that. Then we restore the landscape. So where there's ways that we can do regeneration, which by just taking out some of the threats that's impacting that vegetation, and if that then can restore by itself. So things like taking out weeds, could be excluding stock or changing the way you stock. You might crash graze something rather than constantly graze it. Things like drainage as well. If you can do this, but you're in the floodplain and there's sort of drains, and then you can actually block up some of those drains for parts of your property. Obviously, you've got to think about neighbours and how that's going to fit into a bigger context, but there's some of the things that we can actually do to restore that sort of landscape, so that sort of comes down. And then replanting is what we want to do last. Like, it is critically important. I'm not trying to downgrade the importance, but we're only ever going to do that on a very degraded land. So something that's cleared was ex-farmland, and then we can do large-scale planting projects, and that's important. We also do a bit of planting where we've lost the species diversity in a regrowth patch and things like that. So there'll be certain trees that won't actually be able to spread through, come back because they've been cleared from the landscape too much. So one thing we do find in this now such modified landscape, where we've got patches of good bits of bush, okay bits of bush, heaps of cleared land, heaps of land that's gone to weeds, the species of vegetation that's best adapted to move around the landscape is actually the bird and bat dispersed fruity, like fleshy fruited things like rainforest. So even in places that may not have been rainforest in the past, we're going to get fauna to move those plants in. So that brings up a few issues and challenges. One is that those types of vegetation might move into sclerophyll country that didn't have so much rainforest, or due to previous fire was excluded. But also the flip side of that is a lot of the sclerophyll, it doesn't move far across the landscape. So unless you are really right beneath the big slope of gum trees that are going to be able to blow in and there's bare soil for them to germinate, they're just not going to travel far. So if you don't have sclerophyll like within even a few hundred metres of your property, it's not going to regenerate, and that's why we need to plant. Yep. Unless you're on the floodplain, of course, and it's spread that way. But if you're thinking about how, that's great to think about how is the species going to disperse to come to your site. So yes, it could be because you're on the floodplain, and then you might get a whole bunch of species coming through that way. And yeah, we're talking about structure and we're talking about trees. So we're talking about a tall tree that can then, the seed can blow into the creek to get washed down or can blow down the hill. But if you're like a little grass, you're not going to be travelling far because you just can't regenerate. And then if you're heathland, because a lot of the eucalypt country, koala country is the sclerophyll open forest. And that's got things like either your shrubby sort of sclerophyll peas and acacias or grasslands. But if you're a seed dispersed sort of like heathy type thing and get dispersed by ants, the studies show that it's going to take almost thousands of years for the ants to move you 5 metres every plant generation to get like a few kilometres across the landscape. So just sort of putting that out there for the challenges of what you're trying to create. So it's noble to always be, okay, let's try and restore this plant community to a pre-colonisation plant community, but that just may not be the case now. We can do it, but you're going to have to invest so much money to do that, it may not be practical as well. So I think it's important to think about with your property planning that you kind of can sit comfortably in playing the God a bit because you guys get to manage that land. Aboriginal people have managed land for thousands of years and done that, and so this is part of still humans are going to manage this land, because if we don't put any management in, we will just see invasion of weeds, unwanted plants, which could also be rainforest plants as well in your sort of sclerophyll country. So just to touch on that. Yeah.
I'm not a landowner, but one of the things I find so fascinating about bush regen, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, is that it demands complexity awareness and it demands ultra long-term thinking. I don't think either of those things come naturally to people of settler descent, for the mere fact that we're essentially immigrants and that cultural knowledge has been lost. And I think there's a real relearning that needs to happen, and where we get that information from is from Indigenous people, because as you said, they've been managing the land for a very long time. And I just wondered what you think about that and how we can embrace that,
Yeah, so true. I think the first thing is we kind of really need to let go of the time frames as well. Like in the Western kind of world and the way that we think, everything's very short term and it's very by tomorrow. And something like, working alongside Indigenous practitioners is there's a whole different sense of time. And so we kind of also just have to trust that we're just doing our part in this process, and we trust that somebody else will continue that process. I think the other challenge, though, is we've inherited such a degraded environment. We've lost so much diversity, so much integrity in the landscape. How do we move forward on that? And sometimes we've got to put in techniques that, just seem... I think we have to change the way we think, because we just can't let things naturally regenerate to conserve our biodiversity. I think another thing I like to kind of get across in the regen workshop style things is we do this because we love this work and we love the outcomes of what can be created. There's nothing better than, you know, hanging out in your bush or your garden and seeing the birds come back and the wildlife come back. But part of that same thing is you can't fight nature in the sense and expect to win. You can't fight the weeds. You can't fight these things. All you can do is like intervene in processes to make sure they keep getting steered the right way that nature wants to take them with that succession disturbance cycle. So in doing that, whatever we do, we have to do with kind of joy, because how many people would break themselves trying to get every last bloody devil's fig out of the back paddock or fireweed, or you can become the martyr and just actually really kind of have a pretty bad experience with land management, or change the way you think and think about bigger pictures again, like, okay, well, what's a weed? A weed's an unwanted plant. Is this unwanted plant going to actually change and transform the ecology, or is it going to be gone in 20 years because it's going to be shaded out or something else will occur? So you really, unfortunately, it's the complexities, but you need to kind of, again, it goes back to learn where the minimal amount of inputs, and so you can get the joy, so you can keep going. And then your daughter's like, Mum, let's go up the back paddock and look for koalas again, and then pull out 2 bits of lantana on the way. It's hard, I suppose. Yeah.
So I'll just add to that. It's about observing. So, like, my first job was as a researcher in plant and fire ecology, and it was the start of all that stuff. And it was observing how the plants regenerated after fire or after disturbance, and understanding each species and its role in the landscape. So having that appreciation of how ecology functions and everything is really important, and something that anyone can do. I've been talking over the many years with like local Aboriginal people, and often, like, the old people would say to me that, you know, we've lost so much of that traditional knowledge, that how those things function. And really interesting, old Lewis Cook and I, we used to sit like at least once a week at my place and talk about these things. And he'd say, oh, there was this, you know, and he'd say, that plant there we used to use to make fishing line. And he didn't know what it was called or anything, but I did. So together we rebuilt a lot of that knowledge from what he'd been passed to the science, and how something responds to fire. They haven't necessarily retained that as for the species, but we can still together put the science and the traditional knowledge together to come up with good land management. So I think that, you know, like, it's an understanding that, you know, it's a landscape. It's not just our properties, it's how everything in the landscape fits together and functions. And just on the small trees, the reason they're important too for koalas is that the little ones are great training trees for mums with joeys. So a joey can't climb up and down a huge tree. The mum can take it to the top of a big tree, but once it gets on its own, it can't just climb a big tree. The little ones can be.
Just on what we're talking about with complex systems, I'd just like to say something that Alan Savory says. Alan Savory says if it's man-made, it's not complex because we don't understand complex systems. What we can do is manage complex systems. That's all we can do. We don't have to understand how everything works, and if we try, we don't get it.
So imagine that you're going to stop brush cutting now for the next 10 years. Try and picture, if there's places on the property that you've done that or something, what that might become. And is that going to then impact the trajectory of where you're trying to get to?
I suppose my biggest problem is that I would worry that lantana would take over again in a lot of that area.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah, yep, for sure. I mean, if the lantana is starting to grow and you do brush cut it, it won't kill that lantana. So, like it'll keep coming back. So again, yeah, without sort of seeing it and then going, okay, well, what's your long-term management? I mean, what the idea is, we want to get to a self-sustaining vegetation community where you don't really have to do much at all. And how do we get there? So I know I haven't answered your question, but it's trying to be like thinking about, if you've already got rainforest planted in there, is the community you're going to get to basically going to be dominated by rainforest, and it's going to shade out most of these weeds we're talking about, and therefore all you're trying to do is like ensure that those plants survive. If you're long-term wanting to, you know, over decades create a vegetation community that, you know, those eucalypt plants can actually regenerate through, at some stage before they die, they're going to need bare soil and light for the, you know, people will do things in a different way. And if you want to do brush cutting and someone else might do herbicide and someone else might not do a thing, you can all kind of still get to what you're trying to create, although it might be 3 different journeys. Was that a complete, I didn't answer your question though?
But we have a lot of Soteria as well, and that
Yes.
goes over the trees.
So that Soteria is important. You need to control that. It will shade out in time, and it was one of the first grasses to shade out, but it needs rainforest to shade it out. If you've got wide spacing, and that's the last thing I'll touch on before lunch, but wide spacing eucalypts, they have evolved with grasslands, and there's a whole bunch of ecology about bacteria and fungus in the soil and all these things, which we might touch on the walk if we've got time. But you're never going to shade out Soteria with just wide spaced gum trees, ukes, but ukes can persist in that. So once they're big enough, they're fine, and even with a fire, once they get to a certain age, they'll survive fire as well with grasses like that. So, but at this stage, if it's a young planting, yes, you want to keep on top of those dominant grasses for sure.
But
Yep.
it's an awful grass, and the paspalums. Soteria and the paspalums are really awful grasses for koalas to have to walk through, and they often get the seed caught in their eye and irritated. Like things like kangaroo grass, they don't get, you know, the native microlina and stuff. It might stick on their fur, but it doesn't have those little round seeds that sort of stick in their eyes. So the native grasses mostly are better.
So one point, just touching on sort of creating woodland, like we don't really do it. They do it west and out on the tablelands, and they've sort of got the resources. But here, when you're trying to recreate like a grassy forest, the theory is you actually restore your ground layer first. You don't even put your trees in. So what you'd need to do is convert exotic pasture to native pasture, which can take a few years, and then you plant your trees.
For you and for us and anybody doing it, could you put in like a native ground cover to sort of counteract the other things that are there? Because as you say, the maintenance is pretty high, what you're saying there.
A lot of things will just come in their time. Like, so when I'm restoring, especially plantings, I kind of let them get a little bit weedy with some of these grasses. Like, I'm not kind of like a zero exotic plant person. And then you find that when there's enough shade, things like the ferns, like if you're doing more like a swamp sclerophyll, like a paperbark forest, it might take 5 or 10 years, but the ferns will eventually come through by themselves. So again, how much are we trying to recreate and pushing it too hard, which means we've got to put a lot of work in, or by allowing the natural process and the time with a bit more shade and things like that? Native grass understory, like the basket grasses, like they need quite a bit of shade and then they'll become dominant. But trying to reintroduce basket grass into a sunny paddock, you'll be either having to apply, like do a lot of spraying, like you're going to have to input the inputs right up. So a lot of it's just ensuring that the trajectory's still going in the right way, and then keep managing your site. So in 5 years' time, you might just broadcast a bit of native grass seed like your microlina or your basket grasses if it hasn't come in or something. But trying to do things, force them too soon, just means you've got to put a lot more work in. So when we're planting, there will be very different models on how far apart you plant the trees and the range of species as well. Like your example, a mixture of eucalypts and rainforest. Somewhere else on different soil or wanting a different environment might plant just eucalypts. The recommended planting, if it's only eucalypts and it's just for like koalas and things, is push that out. Like here we're used to planting close to try and shade out weeds, so like 2 meters apart and things. But if it's just eucalypts, you're kind of looking at like the guidelines now talk about more than like 8 meters apart and 10 meters apart, because then you also get better structure. I mean, we'll see it on the walk, but if you look out there, sure, it's also the type of tree, but you don't want eucalypts to grow up tall and fast. There's less low branches for the koalas to sit in. You actually want to create spreading canopy and things like that. But that's another whole workshop. We could just talk about that. But I just wanted to touch on that.
Putting things into the landscape that weren't naturally there to encourage different species. Swamp mahogany comes to mind as a species you might introduce to encourage koalas, but may not naturally have occurred there.
Personally, I don't have a problem with that. If it's thought out and it's part of your management actions, is to have have the plants there to increase the productivity of the land for koalas. Knock yourself out. I mean, I wouldn't. And knowing that they occur nearby somewhere, so it's not like, oh, we're going to get this WA eucalypt because, well, koalas aren't even in WA, but whatever. Like, we're not getting something out of area. So, yeah, I think that's fine if you've thought it through. I think it's fine. I mean, do you guys have a different opinion?
I don't have a different opinion, but I can say, like at Holy Family School at Lennox Head, Peter Cassidy planted a whole bunch of swamp mahoganies there, and there aren't any anywhere near there. And I went and did a talk at the school and told the kids that, keep watching the trees. One day a young boy might come along dispersing and find this patch, and about 3 weeks later they rang me and they had a young boy dispersing in that patch. A friend of mine has one planted up on Buckenbill Mountain, and the koalas love it. They're planted all over the plateau as part of... But the other really interesting thing with swamp mahogany is that it's one of the species that the leaf has been found to retain more moisture just naturally, regardless of where it is. So tallow wood has higher toxicity in its leaves, and with climate change, the drying out, those leaves are going to be more toxic, which puts more pressure on koalas' digestion. So we have to start thinking about climate adaptation in our plantings, and swamp mahoganies are always part of my mix because they're going to be the plant species my opinion, species in the future that saves koalas. And a winter flower, yes. My favourite ute.
Yeah. And just on that, I mean, it's a different tangent, but just the last thing is, think about weeds as well. Like, weeds are just plants at the end of the day. Sure that they can cause a whole bunch of damage doing different things, but they still sequester carbon, they still provide habitat. They've still got a whole bunch of values before they're just a weed. So it's important to think about just removing all the weeds from a landscape. What impact is that going to have if you're not substituting that with something else as well? So I didn't mention that at the start.
So with you talked about Soteria, and we've got giant pastel along with Soteria.
Yeah.
How would that respond to fire?
Yeah, but it doesn't kill it. So no, so you're just going to burn off, and it burns hot and high. So your trees are going to have to be big enough to be able to withstand, because you've got a massive fuel load.
Well, it was 3 metres high when I cut
The Soteria.
the Soteria.
And how tall are the trees?
Yeah, above my head when I'm sitting on the tractor.
Yeah.
And we would like to get rid of the Soteria and the giant paspalum when the trees are high enough and that was my question. If we do cool burns through there every year, will that maybe get rid of it and
Yeah.
get some native grasses
At
back?
Minimide, I've been doing some burning with the Soteria, and my understanding it's been quite successful in changing that. So a few things with management. So usually you wouldn't be trying to look at burning a site every year if it's a natural site that you're trying to restore and understory. But if you're doing it as a weed control, then that's fine. Soteria does get, if you mow it hard, it definitely doesn't like that. Like, it won't kill it, but it knocks it right back. And you don't want to be burning. You're going to probably have to almost slash your Soteria, because your trees are so small, you can't burn for a long time because that will kill your trees.
That's right. But if
So
in
just
5 years'
slash it,
time,
keep it right down, and then I'd put a fire through for the first time.
And Steve, in your place where you're doing that, it's big enough that you can set up a few little plots and try burning in one plot and try slashing in another and see what works best. And then you know what in that landscape and that environment will work best for you.
We were going to tear it down, and it was going good, the grass was coming, but then we had so much rain.
Yeah, of course. One thing that often people think is mutually exclusive, but I don't think it is cattle can be really good to help maintain areas once your trees are big enough. Like, if we've taken fire out of the landscape, cattle is the next best thing at a low stocking rate where you crash graze, don't keep your cattle in there the whole time, knocking down the biomass, and then you take them out. Cattle can do a good job. And then they prevent weeds like lantana and privet and stuff from, at least, they may not chew them to death, but at least it keeps them down as well. So don't think always cattle are bad. Cattle are bad in creeks. Cattle are bad for a whole bunch of things. They'll rub trees, they'll knock them down, ring bark stuff. But as a management technique in a more mature planting, cattle can be quite good if they're managed well. Crash grazed.